Okay, so I'm here in the gaming halls, and Fabio is going to be showing us fantasy football.
You got it. Thank you, Brian. So, fantasy football is a fantasy football game where you're the manager of a team of football players who are fantasy creatures and have special magic abilities. And let's run through it a little bit. So the game starts like any proper fantasy football game would with a card draft. And we have players of different levels, from Hall of Famers, all pros, all the way to rookies. So we start with a card draft for each levels. We do a Hall of Fame draft, pick one, pass the rest. All pros, pick one, pass the rest, and that will set your roster for the game. So we fast forwarded a little bit, and we've each selected our roster. Another important point in the game is to have a balance of the positions, because once you play your players in the starting lineup, which goes here on the board, you cannot repeat the positions of the players. Another thing to keep in mind is each of the players have different magic abilities. Those magic abilities will help augment the statistics in the weekly battles against your opponent. So basically think about it as a tournament in a box. You've drafted your team, you're going to set your lineups, and you're going to go head-to-head against your opponent. Things to keep in mind, like with fantasy sports and specifically with football, bye weeks are very important. So for instance, I wouldn't want to play my running back in week 1 because his bye week is week 1. That would result in 0 points and I would lose the week. So very important thing, like in fantasy football, make sure to check your bye weeks. We're going to emphasize that in the rule book big time. The second thing is the weather cards that come out. So weather's a big part of football. The weather affects some of the statistics of the cards, so that will help you decide what positions, what players to play on certain weeks. So that's the overall game in a nutshell. So you're battling for fantasy points, which are these little tokens. You're going to go through 3 rounds or 3 months of fantasy football. Whoever has the most fantasy tokens make the playoffs. Second and third play in a wild card game, and they battle to then play whoever's in first place for the championship. We've added lots of goodies for gamers, for football fans, for fantasy football fans. I'll give you one specific example that everyone seems to really enjoy. This is the team defense card of the Cheese. And there's a fun reference here. As you can see, this team, the Cheese, may or may not have a wink to the Green Bay Packers. Last year, you'll remember a story that came out about the Green Bay Packers offensive line who love to play Catan together. Well, we have a little wink to that particular part of football history, and if you have a look at the pouch of the player, he's actually holding Catan pieces there. So that's a nice example of some of the fun we've had with the characters, playing with their names, football history, playing on the creatures themselves. So all of it, it can be enjoyed at different levels. You don't have to be a big football fan to enjoy it, because there's fun gaming elements, card drafting, roster building, setting your lineups. But as a football fan, even a football card collector, you kind of get a lot of the humor and fun that we put into the game as well. So some basic details, it's about 10 to 15 minutes per player. So a 2-player game would be 20 to 30 minutes, and it plays up to 6 players. So you constantly play against different players at the board.
I do have a question.
Yes.
What if there is odd number of players, so you can't have a game? Do they sit out?
Right, so for an odd number of players, you would take an odd numbered schedule card. So for instance here, in a 3-player game, we would have us 2 having our own team, but we would also create a ghost manager who would fill in the blanks. So then we would run through the roster, same story, whoever's leading at the end of the schedule, go to the playoffs and face off in the championship.
Okay.
So I think that about covers it. It's a follow-up to our fantasy baseball game, which released earlier this year, and it's a kind of, it really has the football feel of it, especially fantasy football. We tried to incorporate more of the head-to-head battling for wins, the weather, bye weeks, all very specific to fantasy football. And yeah, we're excited about it. It's still a few months away from being ready, but you can keep up to date on things on our Twitter page at CSC Games or our website, cscgames.com. And yeah, that's about it. All right, my pleasure.